Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, March 22nd, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Israel will invade Rafah no matter what the U.S. thinks. So Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer has vowed that Israel will invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah, even if it causes a rift with the United States. So any Israeli attack on Rafah, of course, would incur a huge civilian casualties, since there's 1.5 million people packed into the city, many displaced from elsewhere in Gaza. You know, think about the number of people that are there who were in Gaza City, had to evacuate there, went south, had to evacuate. There's people that have had to move multiple times. And most of the Palestinians in Gaza are packed into Rafah. 1.5 million people. The population is about 2.3 million. So the Israelis are saying that they're going to go ahead with this anyway. They claim that they have a plan to protect civilians or evacuate civilians, but the U.S. has actually said Israel has not presented any plan. So Dermer, who he is a former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and he was actually born in the U.S., so he's American, he said, quote, "We're quite confident that we can do this in a way that would be effective, not only militarily, but also on the humanitarian side. And they have less confidence that we can do it. It will happen even if Israel is forced to fight alone. Even if the entire world turns on Israel, including the United States, we're going to fight until the battle is won," end quote. So, of course, Netanyahu has repeatedly vowed that he will go ahead with the invasion of the city, despite concerns from President Biden. But I don't know if he said anything explicitly as this, saying, even if, we're alone without the United States, we're going to go in. And, Biden has expressed concerns about this whole Rafah thing, and you see Blinken and other Biden officials have as well. But when it really comes down to it, they're still not threatening any consequences if Israel goes ahead with the invasion. So it's just idle concerns, it seems like. I was going to say idle threats, but they're not even really making threats. So Netanyahu has agreed. An Israeli delegation is going to Washington to discuss the plans to attack Rafah. Not sure exactly when that is supposed to happen. But we've seen Netanyahu he basically said he was doing that out of respect for President Biden, but he said he's still going to go ahead with this thing. And of course, a full-scale assault on Rafah would also disrupt aid shipments, because Rafah is where there's the only border crossing into Egypt is. But that's where the only border crossing into Gaza that's not controlled by Israel. So, of course, this would disrupt aid and tighten the starvation siege on Gaza. So it would just be a disaster all around. And, of course, the Israeli government ultimately would like all those Palestinians to go into Egypt, but Egypt has been holding firm on its position that it's not going to take in refugees, although there is that construction happening on the border. They're building this big camp, I guess, preparing for the possibility of Palestinians coming in. All right, so the next one here. House Speaker Johnson says that he will invite Netanyahu to address Congress. So House Speaker Mike Johnson will invite Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Washington to address a joint session of Congress. Just what we needed, right? So Johnson said on Thursday, quote, "I would love to have him come in and address a joint session of Congress. We'll certainly extend the invitation. We're just trying to work out schedules on all of this," end quote. So Johnson is a staunch supporter of Israel and the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. His first move when he became speaker, if you remember, this was back in October, towards the end of October, the first thing he did, he pushed through a resolution declaring that the U.S. stands with Israel that promised open-ended military support. Really a symbolic resolution, but still, that's the first thing he did. So Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, even though he was recently very critical of Netanyahu and called him an obstacle to peace, he seems to welcome the idea of Netanyahu coming over to the U.S. to address Congress. Schumer said in a statement, quote, "Israel has no stronger ally than the United States, and our relationship transcends any one president or any one prime minister. I will always welcome the opportunity for the Prime Minister of Israel to speak to Congress in a bipartisan way," end quote. So on Wednesday, Netanyahu actually spoke with Senate Republicans virtually. He gave them a little address, and I think that was the Senate Republicans' response to what Schumer said. They wanted to show that they supported Netanyahu, that they supported Israel. And he vowed that he will continue this genocidal campaign in Gaza, which has killed at least, so the latest numbers from Gaza's health ministry put out on Thursday was 31,988 Palestinians. And they have said consistently that's somewhere about 2/3 to 70% women and children who have been killed. And there's many thousands of people, bodies under the rubble that haven't been counted. So that was his message. Wasn't public what he said exactly, but the senators, after the address, said that he told them that he's going to keep going, that he's going to finish the job. And of course, there's no realistic end game besides just killing as many Palestinians as he can. So Netanyahu has a history of controversial addresses to Congress. Many people remember back in 2015, he delivered a speech opposing the Iran nuclear deal. And that was, when the Obama administration was getting close to signing it, the Republicans invited him over. So that was a pretty big, controversy there. And of course, he also played a big role in the Trump administration pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, tearing up the agreement. One of his lesser known times speaking before Congress was in 2002. He actually wasn't the prime minister at the time. It was a few years after his first term as prime minister. He testified before Congress. I'm not sure what committee it was, but he was urging that the U.S. invade Iraq, and he pushed the false narrative that Saddam Hussein had WMDs. I'll just read this one quote from him from this testimony that he gave. He said, quote, "There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking, is working, is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region," end quote. So that's who we're dealing with here. And, you think about all the stuff he says about Iran, just all this stuff, just constantly lying to the U.S., to the U.S. public, to get what he wants out of the U.S. That's what his MO is, and I'm sure we will see that. I mean, if he comes and addresses Congress when this horrific slaughter is happening in Gaza and they're all standing up and applauding, I'm sure some Democrats won't go, but man, just the optics of that, it's just insane. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu suggests that the new U.S.-built port could deport Palestinians. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and this is based on something reported by a journalist for Israel's Khan News. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but I figured it was worth running this because he is suggesting that the new U.S.-built, or which is in the process of being built, this makeshift port off Gaza that Biden has ordered to be created by the U.S. military, he suggested that it could be used to deport Palestinians. And this is, again, according to a journalist in Khan News, that he said this at a private meeting of the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Security Committee. And again, I haven't seen this anywhere else, but this is something that a lot of people are suspecting that's what he wants out of this pier, that could be part of the plan, because this, if you remember, there was that report recently that said this was actually all Netanyahu's idea. He floated it back in October, the idea of building a temporary pier. And I think part of the strategy here is them putting as much pressure, starving people, making the place uninhabitable. So eventually, I think they're hoping that the U.S., Egypt, or whoever else says, all right, fine, let's get them out of there. I think that might be part of the thinking here. And so that's what, the U.S. military has deployed to build right off the coast of Gaza. And just the whole idea of it is completely insane. I mean, putting U.S. troops, they're saying that they're not going to go on the ground, but if they're right off the coast, you got to figure Hamas or anybody, a lot of other people in Gaza are, have plenty of motive to try to hit some U.S. troops. And if that happens, I mean, who knows? Imagine the hysteria from Congress. Imagine what they're going to want the U.S. to do if some American troops get killed by Hamas or by a rocket that's fired out of Gaza. Just a mess. All right, so the next one here, rights groups demand that the U.S. end weapons shipments to Israel. So this one's from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And it says Oxfam and Human Rights Watch issued a joint letter calling for President Biden to halt arms transfers to Israel. And they said this was a response to a document released by Israel saying that it uses American-made weapons in accordance with international law. These groups said, quote, any such assurances from the Israeli government, a major recipient of U.S. arms, are not credible, especially in light of the conduct of Israeli forces since the onset of hostilities in October 2023, end quote. And then the organization said that they've documented all these atrocities that are happening inside Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Israel has bombed over 400 healthcare facilities. So this is another one from Kyle. And this is the World Health Organization actually put out these statistics of the attacks on health facilities. And they put out this graphic, and they said there's been 400 attacks on healthcare facilities, and 685 people have been killed in the attacks. 902 people have been injured. 99 health facilities have been affected. 30 hospitals have been damaged. 104 ambulances have been affected, including 54 that have been damaged. So it's just a huge number of attacks on Gaza's healthcare system. And of course, we've seen all these hospitals coming under siege. And the next one here is about the Al-Shifa, the siege on the Al-Shifa hospital, which is still going on. Israeli forces destroy Al-Shifa surgical building and order evacuation. So Israeli forces have destroyed the main surgical building at Gaza City's Al-Shifa hospital following 4 days of siege. The building was blown up on Thursday as Israel tightened its siege of Gaza's largest medical complex. Israeli forces ordered people trapped inside to evacuate before they target the entire facility, according to a Middle East Eye correspondent. So thousands of Palestinians displaced from their homes by the ongoing war had been seeking refuge in the hospital. And early on Thursday morning, Israeli forces warned them that the Air Force would soon begin bombing the complex and that they should surrender themselves. So a video from the hospital shows women and children scrambling to leave, awaiting the army's next orders, as the men were reportedly taken away by soldiers, so they're detaining all the men. And the Israeli army has said that it's killed 140 Palestinians since the start of this raid on Al-Shifa. They claim that they're all fighters. And Hamas denies having any fighters inside the hospital, but there have been confrontations between the Israeli army and Hamas fighters reported outside of the hospital. And Hamas officials are saying that Israel is attacking the hospital to sabotage the truce talks in Qatar. All right. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm a little congested. All right. So the next one here, the Israeli army braced for a Yom Kippur attack and then stood down. So this article is from Haaretz. And essentially what it says is that the Israeli military had some information that there might have been an attack around Yom Kippur last year, which was September 24th. So about 2 weeks before October 7th. And it says unusual Hamas activity along the Gaza border resulted in a boosted troop presence during the Yom Kippur fast. When violence along the border wound down, the IDF had thought that it had deterred Sinwar, the Hamas leader. So essentially what this says is that they put all these extra troops on the border and increased surveillance, and then they didn't see anything, and they thought, oh, he's not going to do anything. He's too scared or something. And then they stood down and they put all the resources back over in the West Bank. And then October 7th happened. And of course, there's all sorts of indications that they had warnings about October 7th. I know one of them was intelligence. Shin Bet said that they had a source in Gaza who warned them of some sort of attack around Yom Kippur. So just more evidence that the Israeli army, the Israeli military had a reason to believe that a big attack was coming. And apparently they're saying they didn't think it could be anything like what happened, the scale of what happened on October 7th. All right, so the next one here, Russia increases artillery shell production by 150%. So Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said on Thursday that Russia's production of artillery shells has increased by nearly 2.5 times over the past year, as Moscow is significantly outproducing the West. Shoigu also said that Russia was producing components for artillery at a rate of 22 times what it could make last year. Shoigu's comments came after CNN reported that Russia was producing nearly 3 times as many artillery shells than the U.S. and Europe combined. That report said, and it was based on a NATO assessment, that Russia had the capacity to produce 3 million shells per year, while the U.S. and Europe could make 1.2 million. So it's been clear for a while now that NATO could not keep up production needed to fuel this proxy war in Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, said last year that Ukraine was using artillery ammunition at a much faster rate than what the entire alliance could produce. And they were still being significantly outgunned by Russia at the time, not as badly as they are now. So because of this shortage of conventional artillery shells, that's the excuse that the U.S. used to dump all these cluster bombs into Ukraine. And I'm not sure the exact number. I bet it's in the hundreds of thousands of cluster artillery shells that they've sent over there. And of course, cluster bombs are notorious for killing and maiming civilians. That's why they're banned by over 100 countries. But that was the reasoning. I mean, you saw Blinken say that publicly was, look, if we don't give them these cluster bombs, they're going to run out of weapons. So it shows how desperate they were, and also just the lack of concern for civilian life in Ukraine, in Russian-controlled Ukraine, and inside Russia, where these things are going to be being fired. Just reveals a lot about them. So just more bad news, especially, you think back to the fact that the idea of weakening Russia is a goal of the U.S. in this proxy war, of course. And this is a way many senators have tried to sell it recently, trying to sell the continued support for Ukraine, is saying, hey, look at all these Russians we're killing. We're really putting hurt into the Russian military. But you see stuff like this, and it just goes to show Russia, this is much more sustainable for them than it is for the U.S. and NATO. And of course, it matters much more to Russia, All right, so the next one here, Western banks warn against giving Russian funds to Ukraine. So Reuters reported on Thursday that some Western banks are lobbying against an EU plan to use profits made by Russian central bank funds that are frozen in Europe to arm Ukraine. So the European Commission has proposed sending up to 3 billion euros to Ukraine per year using this revenue. And again, this is frozen Russian funds, like the interest and stuff that it's making while sitting in the European banks where it's frozen. So they're talking about giving that interest to Ukraine. And Russia, of course, has criticize this plan and say that they will respond. Maria Zakharova, the Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman, she said on Wednesday, quote, "This is outright banditry and theft. These actions are a gross and unprecedented violation of basic international norms. We said we would respond, and so we shall," end quote. And so these banks they're basically lobbying for the EU not to do this because they're worried that if they're involved in the transactions, it will open them up to legal action, especially in the future eventually you figure these sanctions on Russia will be lifted or eased, and then Russia's going to try to get their money. And so it's going to be a lengthy, they're warning that it could be a legal battle that lasts decades. And they're also warning that it would erode trust in the Western banking system, saying that stealing these funds would amount to the weaponization of foreign-held reserves and assets. And the U.S. is looking to take an even more extreme measure. The U.S. wants to give all the Russian funds to Ukraine, not just the money made on the interest, all of it. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen came out very strongly in favor of this idea last month. And now there is legislation that's been introduced in Congress that has a lot of co-sponsors, hasn't been voted on yet, but this is something that I wouldn't be surprised if we see the U.S. do. So about $300 billion in Russian central bank funds are frozen in the U.S., the EU, Japan. I think there might be some in Canada. Most of it's in Europe, over $200 billion, and the U.S. has $67 billion, and that's around the number that Biden's trying to get authorized for Ukraine. He's trying to get another $61 billion. So they're thinking about just taking this money to send to Ukraine. And it's something I know that Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, has said he favors, but it would be an unprecedented step. The U.S. freezes stuff all the time, although they do steal Iranian oil and sell it off. But this is a little more extreme just because of the sheer numbers that we're talking about here. All right. So the next one here, the Houthis assure China and Russia that their ships will not be attacked. So Bloomberg reported on Thursday that Yemen's Houthis have assured Russia and China that their ships will not be attacked while transiting the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea during recent talks in Oman. The report said that in exchange for the assurances, China and Russia may provide political support at the UN Security Council, as they're both permanent members and can veto resolutions. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, have not targeted Chinese or Russian ships, but Beijing and Moscow were likely looking for assurances as the situation in the region has been escalating since the US and UK began bombing Yemen in January. So since the U.S. started the new bombing campaign, the Houthis expanded the scope of their attacks to American and British commercial shipping. Previously, the Yemeni group said that it was only targeting Israel-linked shipping. So this is interesting. And again, the Houthis I think they actually have said publicly before that they wouldn't target Russian and Chinese shipping, but it looked like they wanted some assurances on that. So it'll be interesting, say the U.S. tries to put some UN Security Council resolution through condemning the Houthi attacks or whatever. It'll be interesting to see if Russia or China veto it now, or if they both do. And this goes to show, that there is a clear cause. These aren't just random attacks on all shipping to disrupt global trade. These are targeted attacks, even though in some cases you'll have the Houthis claim that they hit an American ship, and then the ship owner will say that they don't have any ties to the U.S. But for the most part, they're targeting, Israeli-linked and American and British commercial shipping, and they're doing it for a reason. So instead of fixing the root cause, which is the siege in Gaza, the U.S. just, of course, decided to start a new bombing campaign. And this isn't Biden has no authorization for this. He's come under fire from some senators for the fact that he started a bombing campaign in defense of another country's commercial shipping, and there is no legal justification for that. So it's just still going on. I saw this week. So earlier this week, there were some big U.S. airstrikes in Yemen. And then throughout the week, you see these press releases from CENTCOM saying that they intercepted a few Houthi drones. It's just, this thing is not cooling down anytime soon. And of course, the Houthis have said they will stop if the onslaught in Gaza comes to an end. And U.S. officials have actually acknowledged to CNN that they thought the Houthis would be true to their word. All right. So the last story here, the U.S. claims that it has not received a formal request to leave Niger. So a Pentagon official on Thursday insisted that the military-led government in Niger, known as the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, or the CNSP, has not formally asked U.S. troops to leave the country, despite declaring the U.S. presence is no longer legally justified. So Celeste Wallander, an Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, said at a House Armed Services Committee hearing that the CNSP told the U.S. that the agreement that allows the U.S. to operate in the country is now null and void. So they're saying that they said that, but she also said that the CNSP assured that American military forces are protected and that they will take no action that will endanger them. So, they said that they were severing military relations with the U.S. and that their military presence was no longer justified. That sounds like a request to leave, but they're saying they haven't been formally asked. And we know the Pentagon said the other day that they're trying to stay and that they're seeking clarification from Niger. Of course, they have this big drone base and they don't want to leave. They're in talks with other West African countries to base drones there, but this is not a presence that the U.S. wants to give up in Niger. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully this ends with the U.S. pulling out. That's the answer. It's always the answer. So hopefully that's what happens here. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Rick Sterling, how the West upended the world's best figure skater to undermine Russia. One from Norman Solomon, apologists for Israel's mass murder fall back on anti-Semitism claims. One from Ramsey Baroud, perplexed U.S. foreign policy is prolonging Gaza genocide. One from James W. Carden, where is Joe Biden's devil's advocate? And the spotlight is from Jeremy Hammond, U.S. humanitarian aid to Gaza is a cynical PR ploy. So please go check all that out. Go check out the blog. We have a lot of good stuff in there. Kyle Anzalone's great show, Conflicts of Interest. Connor Freeman was just on with Judge Knapp on Judging Freedom with Judge Napolitano, which is really cool. So you go watch that. Kyle's been a regular on his show. He's been doing it like once a week for a while now, which is really cool because the Judge's show is awesome and he has a pretty big audience. So go check this stuff out in the blog. Lots of stuff to still read on antiwar.com if you listen to this show. So please go check out the page. To support this show, you could share it, tell your friends about it, like, subscribe, comment. Follow us on Instagram. It's looking really, really, really great over there. Thanks to Addie, who's helping us out with the posts. It just looks good. I think I said it for a while. I was trying to figure out how to do Instagram right. I've never been good at it, but it's looking really nice. And of course, follow me on Twitter at @TheCampDave. Follow antiwar.com at antiwarcom. Our account's getting pretty big on there. It's almost at 90K, the antiwar.com account. So go follow us there if you don't. I will be back after the weekend. I hope everybody has a good one. I'll talk to you in a few days. Thanks for listening.